welcome to the program. Thank you for the invitation.
How does China's democracy work? In CGTN's first ever show featuring an AI-generated co-host, Liu Xin explores this pressing issue. Different perspectives agreeing to disagree.
China's democracy works for China.
The Western system is completely different. It's based on competition.
Democracy is not only about voting, it's not only about election.
Performance is the most important thing.
A whole new dimension to a fundamental question of our time. China, democracy that delivers, only on CGTN.
You can't eat democracy. Zambia's President Hichilema put it bluntly last year. It is a stark reminder that governance isn't just about abstract ideals, it's about food on the table also. An international survey on democracy conducted in 30 countries found people in developed countries have a very low level of trust in their politicians. They believe they don't work in people's best interests. That's 29% for the United States, 20% in the UK, 12% in Japan, and so on and so forth. But in developing countries, the number is much higher. China, for instance, leads by a whopping 76%. That's a clear slap in the face for Western politicians who invoke democracy incessantly. As China's top legislators and political advisors gather for their annual deliberations, let's delve into how China's democracy is able to win that high level of trust. Welcome to a special two-part series called China, Democracy That Delivers. I'm Liu Xin in Beijing. And I have a very special co-host who's making its debut. Yes, its debut. But first, let's meet our distinguished panelists. They are from New York, Dr. Robert Lawrence Kuhn, chairman of the Kuhn Foundation. From Marseille, France, David Ferguson, Honorary Chief English Editor of China's Foreign Languages Press. Here in the studio, Xia Lu, Research Fellow of the National Academy of Development and Strategies of Renmin University of China, and Ms. Miao Xiaojuan, journalist from Xinhua News Agency, China's official news agency. So the warmest welcome to all my panelists. But first, let's meet, as I promised, my AI co-host, Liu Xiaoxing, literally meaning mini Xing. In fact, Xiaoxing also means in Chinese, be careful. It's an AI animated version of me based on my image and voice. She might not be as charming as I, but she can regurgitate everything we feed her. And in today's case, it comes from ChatGPT, and it's about democracy and China. So let's bring her on. Hello, Xiaoxing. Welcome to the program. Hello, Liu Xin. I am pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. According to ChatGPT, what are the three most prominent aspects that developed countries care most about Chinese democracy? The three most prominent aspects that developed countries prioritize regarding Chinese democracy include its adherence to universal standards of human rights and political freedoms, the transparency and accountability of its governance practices, and the extent of citizen participation in decision-making processes. These aspects serve as indicators of China's commitment to democratic principles and directly influence its standing in the international community, trade relations, and regional stability. What about people in developing countries? What are the three most prominent aspects they care most about Chinese democracy? Developing countries are primarily interested in three key aspects of Chinese democracy. First, its ability to promote economic development and poverty reduction strategies. Second, its approach to governance that prioritizes stability and social order. And third, its model of state-led development that offers an alternative to Western democratic norms. These aspects resonate with developing nations seeking paths to progress that are compatible with their own cultural and political contexts, while also addressing pressing socio-economic challenges. And finally, why do developed countries and developing countries perceive Chinese democracy so differently? Differences in how developed and developing countries perceive Chinese democracy arise from distinct priorities. Developed nations emphasize human rights and transparency, while developing countries prioritize economic development and stability. Developed countries view Chinese democracy through universal values, whereas developing nations see it as a viable alternative, aligned with their governance experiences and progress goals. These varied perspectives reflect the interplay of political ideologies, global dynamics, and local priorities shaping perceptions of Chinese democracy globally. Thank you, Xiaoxing, for your presentation. Very interesting, and please stay with us. You are welcome. I'll be here. All right, let's bring in our panelists, real people now. And let me go first to Dr. Kuhn there. Dr. Kuhn, is this the first time that you hear such a presentation? What do you think of the answers that we got from ChatGPT? Do they more or less reflect in the real world how people in developed countries and developing countries perceive Chinese democracy?
I think in general it is correct. I would be hesitant to generalize too quickly. It's a complex story to understand properly. What I think is most interesting is to focus on China's democracy and to understand how not only how it works, but how important it is. And I like to start with the big picture, which is, as President Xi Jinping puts it, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And the way that is described is by 6 aspirational adjectives. These are adjectives to define what the great rejuvenation of China would look like. And without going in detail, prosperous, strong. I'm going to skip the third, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. But the third I left out was democratic. So the third aspirational adjective that China uses, that President Xi uses to describe China, is democratic. And I think that alone would surprise some people in developing countries, that China puts that on such a high level, the highest possible level. And so then what we have to do is drill down and understand what China means by the concept of democracy. Yeah. And it is, simply put, it has a broader meaning in China than it does in most developed countries.
Dr. Kuhn, very interesting points you brought up, but let's come back to that in just a moment. But let me go to my guest in Marseille, France. Thank you so much, David. What do you think explains the different perceptions of China's democracy in people in developed countries and developing countries? Do you think Xiaoxing's presentation was more or less, a reflection of reality?
Well, I think it takes time, Liu-Xin, for AI to develop an understanding of nuance and an ability to express nuance. And I think what we heard there was what we would expect from a relatively underdeveloped understanding of democracy. I think at the same time, it was a relatively accurate portrayal of how people in the West perceive democracy. And they think of democracy, it's about votes, it's about elections, it's about getting to choose your leaders, it's about freedom of speech, it's about transparency. What is much more interesting to me, and I'm sure that we will explore this in more detail in the next hour, is what do these things look like in reality? How does the reality match up to the ideals?
Let's get back to that, certainly, and we will talk about different concepts, different approach, different understanding of the idea democracy. Let me come back to my guests here in the studio. And Xiaojuan, let me get to you first, because you have done extensive field work in China. You, for instance, did this film about mayors in China, and you went into their meeting rooms, you went into their consultation sessions and saw firsthand how decisions are made in China. So do you agree, for instance, with what Xiaoxing find out on ChatGPT about China's emphasis or China's priorities when it comes to democratic decision making?
Thank you. So when I looked into the answers of Xiaoxing, I think it's very interesting. It's also complicated, but I wouldn't say I agree with her 100%. For me,
what do you not agree with, for instance?
I agree with the priority part, saying that developing countries share similar priorities. But I think for the developed nations, it's not just about priorities. I think the reason behind their conclusion comes largely from prejudice. So developed nations tend to think there's only one form of democracy, which is Western democracy, that is defined by multiple parties and elections every several years. And any democracy or any system that's different from Western system cannot possibly be democratic. So when Western countries look into Chinese democracy, one, they tend to ignore the outcomes or the ends of Chinese democracy. And secondly, they also turn a blind eye to the means or the procedures of Chinese democracy, which is how elections work in China. So that leads to the conclusion that China does not have democracy, which is not true. And on the other hand, developing countries, I think they tend to be more open-minded towards Chinese democracy because they look into both the ends and the means of democracy. And also they are seeking good governance. They're looking for development. They prioritize development and bettering the lives of its citizens. That's why it's as much as what China is doing right now. That's why they can see that Chinese government succeeds in delivering results and bettering the lives of the citizens. That's when they recognize that's democracy in action.
Let me go to Mr. Xia here. Very interesting discussion we already have. If you ask any person in the West about democracy, they will tell you that it comes from a Greek word, that it comes from demo and kratos, which means people and power respectively. So in essence, they say democracy about power of the people, but there's not a definition as to how this power of the people can be exercised, and somehow it's innately assumed that that is through the Western liberal way of decision making. What is your understanding? How is China's political system a form of exercising the power of the people or allowing the people to exercise their power?
Before I answer this question, I would like to get back to the previous one a little bit, the difference between developed nation and developed nation in terms of the perception of Chinese democracy. Actually, the people in developed nation or developed country, their idea or their understanding about democracy is more about, let's say, simplistic, much simplistic. They have this kind of understanding about democracy. First, they think democracy can solve every problem, every issue, as much as the democracy have already solved their problem. Secondly, they thought or they think there is one standardized democratic practice for all of the world, for all of the country. Well, for the first kind of assumption or hypothesis, I would like to raise an example of an African country. This country is Liberia, and this country actually was one of the earliest independent nations in Africa. Well, actually, it got independence in 1854 when China was still under Qing kind of empire rule. Back then, the Taiping Rebellion was still there. But how did it do, or how has it been doing, the Liberia doing 100 years later? It's not like they thought. So still within the list of the so-called failed nation or failed state. So that means democracy couldn't solve every problem, right? And also, of course, Liberia, the democracy in Liberia just copied the model of the United States in the mid of 19th century. And the second thing is that what we have seen in the report of President Xi Jinping in the 20th National Congress of the CPC, well, the democracy or the other kind of common value have already been upheld and advanced by the CPC. So that means China or the Chinese leadership has already stand in the value of democracy. But the difference is that different people in different countries should have their own understanding about how democracy should work and how democracy should solve their own problem. Because different countries have different problems, then democracy should have different, variant to solve this problem. That's my understanding in this point.
Well, a very quick going back to the fundamental question which Dr. Kuhn raised there, I think more or less we touched upon a very fundamental question, which is the different definition or different approach to democracy. Dr. Kuhn, what is the definition of democracy according to China, according to the CPC, and how is that different from those in the West?
China's concept of democracy is a broader one. It goes well beyond the one person, one vote, multi-party system, freedom of speech, free media. That is one part. One of the problems I think our discussion is having, we're taking two concepts, one of development and one of democracy, and homogenizing them. Those are two separate concepts. It's like Venn diagrams. They intersect, but they're two completely different subjects, and each one can be addressed. And I think what is most admired about China in the developing world is China's development. Now that articulates with the concept of democracy, but it's not the same thing. So we have to be careful on what model we talk about. China's democracy works for China at this point, and that needs to be appreciated and understood. And we can really explain that. I had spent several years in the understanding the anti-poverty, the poverty alleviation campaign, and how that works for roughly 100 million Chinese people. That's part of China's democracy. But it's also, in Western sense, that would be China's development. And so we have to understand the differences between the two. From China's point of view, democracy is results-oriented, as other panelists are saying. It deals with anti-poverty, common prosperity, building the country. All of those things are part of China's development. And the democracy part of it is engaging the people more so in the process of governance. It's not through elections of senior leaders, but it's through a multiple series of things that China uses, from local elections at the very local level to the anti-corruption campaign. We have to understand the real differences.
Right. Let me bring in a small case. A party secretary of the community level party committee by the name of Tan Dao Liang. He has been working in this job for over 20 years, and his main responsibility is to take care of 200 plus people who live in the community and coordinate their different needs and aspirations and solve problems for them on a daily basis. Let's take a look at this package and continue our discussion.
In this densely populated community, a construction project has drawn some complaints from the residents.
我们这房子本来就漏，咚咚咚照得我们震得我睡不着觉。
离周边50米范围内呢，大致涉及的101户居民，200多人。为此呢，咱们社区党委在受干扰的这23户居民里边，找到我们每一位党员，同时施工方一同党员参与开社区党委会。一方面呢，我们要查找源头。 看看这个工程到底是什么样一个情况。二一个呢，走访每一户居民，看看每一个居民的家庭受干扰的程度，把这些详细的情况我们都了解透、了解到位。
Under Secretary Tan's leadership, the residents and the construction company understood each other better. They were more willing to think in each other's shoes and consider each other's needs.
绝对要让开夜间的施工。 离着非常近的居民住户，在他的窗户前面要建立隔音板，同时单加一套防护墙。
后来我们跟书记说了，书记马上让那个工程的那个人员呢，给重新的 给拆了，给加固。你看那现在弄得多好啊！
这个20多年的工作啊，基本呢是和每一户居民都有了交集，居民的诉求都能够在咱们社区得到满意的解决。
So basically, we're talking about the protagonist, Mr. Tan, was trying to solve a problem for the community because of disruptions caused by noises on a nearby construction site. How he solved the problem. Miao, you, as I said, you went to different cities and followed the footsteps of 4 mayors in their decision making. What's the difference between the Chinese way of solving problems, taking into consideration the interests and aspirations of different interest groups, and what we see in an international setting, maybe?
Thank you for the
question. What's the most striking feature that you have observed in your investigation?
For me, just like when we watched this video about this grassroots party secretary, obviously, for one, he has been working for the community for many years. He said more than 20 years. So that means he must have earned the trust of the locals. And secondly, I noticed that he was paying attention to details and he was listening to the villagers and trying to figure out what they really want, and he respects them, and then they comes to conclusions or solutions together. So as you were asking about what struck me the most, I would agree with Dr. Kuhn said earlier about the engagement or the commitment of the local government to help and communicate with the local citizens first and to take care of their needs. Usually when they make a decision, because the decision-making process has to be both democratic and effective. So when they wanted to make something happen or get something done, they always solicit public opinion. They often come up with innovative ideas with the help of both the locals and expertise. Western democracy is mostly about campaigns and promises, but in China, democracy is about delivering results, about capabilities and performance. So what drives all the officials to serve the people? For one, they do have noble missions. They know their job is to serve the people. And they also know that if they cannot deliver results, if they cannot improve the lives of the people, they won't get any promotion. So their performance is the most important thing.
The career is on the line.
Yes.
In a way. David, what do you think is the different style of engagement between the Chinese way of soliciting different opinion and coming to a decision, and the Western way of doing the same thing?
The fundamental principle of the Chinese system is that it is about consultation and cooperation and consensus. It's about people coming together to try to identify the right thing to do and to make sure it happens. The Western system is completely different. It's based on competition, and it's based on confrontation, and it's based on conflict. And they boast about that. They make a virtue of that. The problem is that most normal people don't enjoy conflict. They don't actually enjoy conflict in their family or with their friends or at work. So you have a system that encourages people who do enjoy conflict, people who want power for the sake of power. You have a system that encourages these people to flourish. It nurtures these people, it brings them to the top. So on the one hand, you have a system that brings out the worst in people and gives them the right of governance. And on the other hand, you have a system that tries to encourage people who actually want to do good for society and want to do good for people. And I think that's where the fundamental difference lies between the two systems.
Dr. Kuhn, I wonder what is your take on the same question? And some people would say, Look, there are cases where democracy is failing in people in some societies, but by and large, it gives people have the impression that the system has been working. You know that if one government has not performed, then people vote it out, and like that, you have accountability. That's how they would say it. What is your reaction, Dr. Kuhn?
Sure, it's a complex question. David and I agree on many things. I would not entirely agree with his last presentation on the differences between the systems. And I think you're hitting on a primary point, and that is not just accountability, but checks and balances. There's no perfect system. I mean, no system on earth has been God-given as the ultimate system for all time working. That's not the case. We're looking in a complex world for optimization. What are the optimal ways of doing things? And it continuously changes. And that's one of the benefits of what the CPC has done. They're willing to change within certain limits over time and testing things with pilot-free trade zones and specific policies that they test in different areas before rolling it out. So all that is very, very good. But to oversimplify that democracy doesn't work and development, we're confusing a lot of different terms here we need to distinguish between development and democracy. What is it about China's society that makes it successful over this time in terms of development? That's a deep question to understand, and it's many levels, and it's fascinating.
Some people would ask this question, and let me bring in Mr. Xia here, and I'll get back to Dr. Kuhn if there are further clarities that are needed. Some people would say, well, China achieved a tremendous amount of development, but if the Chinese system is not democratic, how could it have achieved such development?
Well, thanks for the question. In order to answer this question, I would like to bring two important books written by American scholars dealing with the function of democracy or whether there are function of democracy. The first one is written by Professor Lily Cai, who used to be an MIT professor. Now she's moving to the Hong Kong UST, University of Technology and Science. And her dissertation, doctoral dissertation, became a book titled Accountability Without Democracy. And she studied the township and the village level Chinese official or Chinese cadres kind of accountability in dealing with the drainage, in dealing with the poverty, in dealing with those kind of the rural development thing. And her argument is that although there are no standardized democratic procedure in China's rural area, according to those Western scholars, there are accountability, because this accountability or the driving force of this rural level official to do this kind of thing, to solve all this kind of problem, is not from they would be voted out for next term. It's because they have their kind of commitment or let's say devotion to the local development. This is not about democracy or not. This is not about democratic procedure. So her argument, Professor Lily Cai's argument, is that although there is no so-called standardized Western democracy or democratic procedure, there are still accountability and there are still this kind of function of this system. Well, on the other hand, Professor Francis Fukuyama, who is very famous, actually almost 30 years ago, he published a book called End of the History and The Last Event, something like that. He argued that, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the former, communist region, there would be no challenge in political system towards the liberal democratic system in the U.S. And he argued that, when all the countries in this world adopted and established those kind of liberal democratic system, there would be no history because there would be no variant in humans kind of civilization. Well, after 1 decade, when he also studied, Iraq and Afghanistan after this kind of 2 wars, he changed his argument. He changed his idea since that he thought that the state building, state capacity is much more important, is much more significant than to just borrow or to copy other countries' standard, model to a kind of developing country. So the most important thing is not to change the form, but to solve the real problem. And in my opinion, just to get back to your question, China's political system, China's whole process process people's democracy actually tackled this essence of China's problem in terms of development. And that is the pragmatic orientation.
Right? Yeah, the pragmatism. Okay, you mentioned that. David, just now Dr. Kuhn was talking about let's not mix development and democracy, and he didn't agree with your proposition of sort of a black and white approach to the problems in the Western style of democracy and the gains in the Chinese style of democracy. Do you have some reaction? What is your reaction? And again, I'm fascinated with the question, if China's system is not a democratic one, how could it achieve such tremendous development? I honestly, would wonder that.
Well, let me respond to that. At the end of the day, democracy is just a label. All it is it's a label that people put on things. And then you can have a great argument about, we're more democratic than them. They're not democratic. Are they democratic? Are they not democratic? There's a simple question to answer in all of this. Does this country have good governance? Does the governance of this country deliver good outcomes? And if the answer to this question is yes, this country has good governance, and yes, this country's governance delivers good outcomes, it doesn't really matter what label you apply to it. And if you ask these questions about China's democracy, whatever you call it, if you ask this question about China's governance, it delivers good outcomes. And if you subject so-called Western democratic countries to that very simple question, do you have good governance and does your governance deliver good outcomes? You end up with a very, very different answer.
Yeah, I've been watching a special production on CGTN, China, Democracy That Delivers. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, exactly how does China's political system works? Stay with us.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN, see the difference.
The National People's Congress, China's top legislature, and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the country's advisory body, convene their annual sessions in Beijing. Lawmakers and advisors will assess the country's performance, craft laws, and refine policies that will chart a course of China's ongoing modernization drive. Beijing once again hosts the two sessions, where China takes stock of what it has achieved and where it's headed next. Join us as we bring you highlights and analysis of China's agenda in our special coverage of the two sessions here on CGTN.
China operates a system covering a population of more than 1.4 billion people with 56 different ethnic groups. What are the difficulties in its governance? And steeped in a continuous civilization spanning thousands of years, how does Chinese culture inform its modern political system? Welcome to part 2 of a special program on China, Democracy That Delivers. I would like to reintroduce our guests. They have been from New York, Dr. Robert Lawrence Kuhn, chairman of the Kuhn Foundation, joining us from Marseille, France. David Ferguson, Honorary Chief English Editor of China Foreign Languages Press. Here in the studio, Xia Lu, Research Fellow of the National Academy of Development and Strategies of Renmin University of China, and Miao Xiaojuan, journalist with China's official Xinhua news agency. Once again, warm welcome to all of my guests. But first, let's take a look at a brief intro to the history and structure of China's political system. A persistent debate revolves around whether China is a democracy or not. Critics often lament the fact that key policies seem to be orchestrated behind closed doors by party elites. China's democracy actually features aspects that are representative and electoral. It's referred to as pro-process people's democracy or democracy with Chinese characteristics. However, to grasp the essence of democracy in China, it is imperative to delve into its historical roots and understand its rationale. Following the revolution of 1911, there were multiple attempts by China to adopt Western political systems such as parliamentary, multi-party or presidential systems, all of which failed. On October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was founded, marking the transformation from a millennia-long feudal autocracy to a people's democracy. For the first time in history, the Chinese people became masters of the country. In 1954, the first constitution of New China was adopted at the first National People's Congress, or NPC. The People's Congress system was established. How does it work? The NPC is the highest organ of state power. It creates all administrative, supervisory, judicial, and procuratorial organs of the state. Deputies to People's Congresses are elected every 5 years. Those at township and county levels are directly elected by the public, while deputies to the higher levels are elected from among candidates at the next lower level. In 2023, there were altogether about 2.8 million deputies to People's Congresses at all levels. 95% of them were directly elected by voters. And there are a total of over 1 billion voters in China. Other forms of elections also take place. For instance, rural and urban residents elect members to community committees to manage their own affairs. By 2020, all villages and urban communities in China had elected such committees, numbering over 600,000 in total. As to political parties, China has 9 political parties, including the ruling party, the CPC, and 8 non-communist parties. In China, political parties don't compete for the power to govern, which ensures continuity of policies. The 8 non-communist parties work together with and under the leadership of the CPC in order to create synergy in exercising state power. Members of these parties and those without party affiliation account for a certain percentage of legislators at all levels, some occupying leading posts in state organs. Every year, thousands of top legislators and political advisors meet in Beijing to submit motions and proposals on how to improve governance. From 2018 to 2023, the central government adopted a total of 18,000 suggestions and proposals tabled by national lawmakers and political advisors, 40% of which became policy measures. In a nutshell, China's democracy is born out of its traditional wisdom and tested by time. It is the choice of the Chinese people. It may be new for some, but has worked wonders for China and continues to deliver. Let's continue our discussion about Chinese democracy. One persistent debate revolves around that whether China is a true democracy or not. Critics often lament that key policies were made not based on the feedback from the masses, but rather made by a small group of people or even one person. Xiaojuan, let me come back to you. What exactly is the Chinese decision-making process seen from the mayor level, and is that representative of the whole chain of decision-making process in China, meaning from the grassroots to the very top?
Yes, I think like at different levels, they might be slightly different in terms of details, but the philosophy or the structure behind it is very consistent. So speaking from the mayor's level, which is what I have observed with my own eyes, I think probably I can give a few examples to explain how decisions are made for the local governments and for different cities. For example, in Zhangzhou City, Fujian province in southern China, they have lots of tulou, or the traditional earthen buildings. The government wants to revitalize or restore those buildings to protect the cultural heritages and also to improve the local economies. There were lots of disagreements. The residents living in those buildings, they had lots of opinions, they were against it, and they have concerns. So what the government did was to request a representative from each household, and for about 100 days, more than 3 months, they sit together and they work out a plan. They find a consensus that everyone agrees, or the majority would agree. And then they also invite the best experts in industry to help design and to make a long-term plan. And they didn't go for a full implementation at the beginning. They tried for in a smaller area to have some pilot projects. Mm-hmm. And when the other residents see that, oh, these smaller projects are working, so they like to follow. And now it's a massive success. And I think that decision-making process is both democratic and effective. And it not only helped preserve the cultural heritages, but also boosted rural tourism and increased the incomes of the villagers. And the other decision-making process example, I think it has to come from within the government. Yeah. When you sit by and watch how they have meetings, one thing that impressed me the most was how they always have the highest level official. In our case, is the mayor. The mayor always speaks the last.
What is the role of the party secretary, for instance, after, because you're talking about the mayor, they are different. How does the consultation results of the administrative branch is approved or disapproved by the party secretary? How does that work?
From the mayor part, it's mostly administrative, and to the best of my knowledge, once they make a decision, they would have to go through the higher level of discussion, and after that, it has to be approved by the local People's Congress. Yeah. So it's voted by the lawmakers. Yeah.
Dr. Kuhn, I see you seem to have a lot of thoughts to share. What was on top of your mind when you hear the differences between the Chinese decision-making and the Western decision-making? Are the observations correct according to you? Because you also travel extensively in China.
Yeah, and I would begin with the how the system works in China, which I followed during the poverty alleviation campaign. And what I actually spent time with was 5 levels of party secretaries at the provincial, municipal, county, township, and village level. So there were 5 levels, and I worked with the party secretary in each case, and saw what the division of labor was, what the responsibilities were, who had what responsibility. And I had one, which to me was a very poignant example. I was having lunch with the party secretary at the county level, and in the anti-poverty campaign, and in many things, the implementation of these projects have a center point at the county level in China, which can be 1 million, 2 million people, but it's a county level. And I was with the party secretary, and he asked me what I was doing. And I said the day before I was in a village, and I met the local party secretary, a young man, maybe late 20s, early 30s, who was spending a year or two away from his family. He visited a couple of times a month, but he was working with 150 or 200 families in that area. And I was very impressed. I rode with him on his motorcycle. And what impressed me even more was the party secretary. As soon as I told him my little story, he called over his assistant. He said, cancel my meetings tomorrow. I'm going out to meet that party secretary in that county. I want to understand what he's doing that so impressed Dr. Kuhn. And that to me was really impressive. And the thing about China, and what David said before is absolutely right, that competence and governance is very critical. And the training of officials in China is at a very high level. Now, it's not perfect because nothing is perfect with human beings. And the issue that China deals with the benefits of top-down leadership, and they're very clear what those are. But the counter to that is what happens when it doesn't work, when there's something that goes awry, because there's no institutionalized system for correcting that. And so that's the tension. That deals with the party's anti-corruption campaign, the national the commissions to investigate. And, so China has its own way of dealing with these things. But, we really have to, in today's world, deeply understand how each culture works in its own way, and then be very careful about trying to transmit that to other kinds of cultures, because each one has its own problems and areas, and why China has worked so well developmentally has to do with a lot of factors that don't necessarily only deal with a certain kind of political system.
Of course.
Because we see examples of that in other countries which have not worked at all.
Yeah. David, let me go to you here. And it's, again, another fascinating question for me, because you have been working on President Xi Jinping's thoughts on governance. You read through and edited the English versions of all of his major speeches, presentations, or you had a thorough scanning and understanding of President Xi's thoughts. And one thing that struck a lot of people is that he quotes extensively from traditional Chinese literature, from traditional Chinese texts. And there is a re-emphasis of combining China's political system, or recognition of the cultural roots of China's modern political system, which is steeped in China's long-term culture and civilization. What makes China different in terms of culture from other societies which inform its political system today?
The most important facet of that, Liu Xin, is that China's culture genuinely goes back thousands of years. And if I was to take one specific example, there is something called He culture, which is about harmony and diversity. And that has been a very important theme in Chinese culture for a very, very long time. China seeks harmony. It seeks to build the consensus that Robert was talking about. It seeks to build agreement. At the same time, recognizing diversity of ideas, recognizing diversity of opinion. And if you can succeed in bringing these two factors together in a positive way, then you will gain from the diversity, and you will create a consensus about this is what we want to do, and this is how we want to move forward. And I think that it's a really important aspect of President Xi's governance, that he places such emphasis on this. He looks back into ancient Chinese culture. He looks for inspiration.
Yeah.
He finds ideas and he tries to make them meaningful to modern China and to show how these can become important drivers of China's modern governance.
Xiaojuan here, do you agree with that analysis, the philosophical or cultural difference behind China's choice of its political system and the Western choice? And one criticism is the lack of transparency. You know, a lot of things are done behind doors, consultations done behind doors, and people think that, you know, that is not democratic. If you don't show it to the world, if you're not transparent, we don't know how the decision is made. So there may be elements of corruption. What is your understanding?
China invented the examination system for selecting government officials. So the modern democratic system, I think it inherits traditional political wisdom and then adapts it to the contemporary situation. Just a little bit back to what David said earlier. So I think that's why China's democratic system has its own strength. It comes a long way back to the ancient times. And
why is the Western voting system not compatible to the Chinese emphasis on harmony? We don't like to quarrel in public.
I think the Chinese system, it breaks some of the invisible thresholds of wealth, background. So it's based on virtue, competence. So if you're competent enough, you will stand out. And that's how you realize on the competent people.
But people will say you can do that in public too. I mean, can't you have, you know, there are also competition where people show their competence, demonstrate their competence in public. Can't that be done here in terms of, is that being done? Yeah?
Yes, please allow me to just to jump in. I'm sorry. First of all, yes, voting could solve some kind of a disagreement, but it should be within a homogeneous kind of situation. If a society, well, has a lot of cleavages, for example, societal cleavage, regional cleavage, and different cultural cleavages, and voting might not be solving the problem at one stance. Voting, this kind of thing, might expand or might, let's say, reinforce or even, you know, worsen this kind of social cleavage situation, like what I have seen in a lot of countries, like what I have seen in a lot of kind of newly independent, the former colonists in African countries. Like, so it's not about the voting. We always say that, okay, voting, you know, costs a lot of, no, it's not about voting. Voting is just one procedure. We couldn't blame everything to voting. We should combine the whole situation together to think about what is the problem. So in my opinion, for developing countries, let's getting back to the first one question, what is the most important thing or what are the priorities for developing countries? The first thing is national unity. Is the solidarity for one, you know, premature society. If one country or if one society, well, it's just newly established, and there are a lot of issues to be solved in terms of to consolidate the social, let's say, solidarity, in consolidated identity, well, voting might not be the effective way to solve the problem. On the other hand, or otherwise, it might, you know, worsen the situation. So, well, let's just put it, voting is the way to solve the problem, but we should consider the time and the location.
It's part of a good governance system, maybe not everything. David.
Can I step in there? You asked the question, why shouldn't voting work well in China? It does work well in China. In China, a lot of Western people don't understand that at the grassroots level, there are direct elections for the governors, the people who actually run the system, the people's congresses. They are directly elected up to the county level or the district level. And it works really well. Why does it work really well? Because it's on a human level. It's on a human scale where you know the people that you are voting for. And it does work. It works in China.
Well, I was mentioning about this direct voting for the leader of the country, like that's like the one practiced in some country, but not in the United States, which is also a misperception here. I'm running out of time, but we have one last segment where I would ask you and ask Xiaoxing to come out again to address questions raised to us by people from the internet. And the first one actually is very much related to what we just talked about. If the Chinese system is so effective, why does it only work in China, and why do other developing nations not adopt it? Who would like to take up that question?
I would like to question the fundamental logic of this question. Why would other countries adopt China's political system? Why would other countries adopt China's model of political system in solving China's problem? Well, different countries should pursue their own, let's say, forms of political system to solve their own problem, right? So, the fundament or the fundamental, the logic of this question, well, maybe we should rethink about the fundamental. Maybe we have already been, let's say, influenced by typical or standardized understanding about if that country is doing well, we should learn from that country. If that country is doing good, we should copy that country's kind of a model of the political system. We should learn the experience. We should learn the good kind of lessons.
Emulate.
But we shouldn't just simply copy that country's political system. So
Finally, I put the last question to Xiaoxing. Let's not forget her. Basically, I put the last question to ChatGPT and asked Xiaoxing now to appear again and present the answers to us. So, Xiaoxing, time to wake up. Welcome back. Yuxin, I'm still here. I almost fell asleep. But tell me, what's the question from the overseas user? Thank you for your patience. So the question is, why is the Chinese government so much more effective than any other government? Again, it's a question from an online user. The effectiveness of the Chinese government compared to others stems from several factors. One key element is its ability to implement long-term plans and policies efficiently, often leveraging its centralized decision-making structure. Additionally, China's emphasis on pragmatism and adaptability allows it to respond swiftly to changing circumstances, fostering stability and growth. Moreover, the government's focus on development and improving living standards has garnered support from its populace, contributing to its effectiveness in delivering tangible results overall. The combination of strategic planning, adaptability, and a focus on development has played a crucial role in making the Chinese government more effective than others in certain contexts. Thank you very much, Xiaoxing. That's all for today for you. You are welcome. Goodbye. Okay, finally, a quick show of hands. What do you think? What do my four guests think of the answer? Is it by and large okay? Yeah, I see people nodding by and large. All right, so Xiaoxing is... its debut has been successful one, I can say. Thank you so much. It's been such an interesting discussion. Many thanks once again to all my guests, Dr. Robert Lawrence Kuhn joining us from New York, chairman of the Kuhn Foundation, David Ferguson joining us from Marseille, France, who is honorary chief English editor of China's Foreign Languages Press, Xia Lu, research fellow of the National Academy of Development and Strategies from Renmin University of China, and Miao Xiaojuan, journalist from China's official Xinhua news agency. Thank you very much.